Dave, go for it.
Okay, welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Dave Jacobs. I'm the chair of the Cape Fear Surf Rider. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. In particular, Maya Deary and Brad Turner, who sort of created this position, which I'll get to in a minute. Chad Nelson, our CEO from Surfrider National, is on board, I believe, in this call, which is great. And I think that sort of lends weight and emphasis to what not only Surfrider Cape Fear is trying to do, but also Surfrider National, and to raise awareness of these issues. There, some of them which are covered in this book we're going to discuss. And we obviously thought it was important enough to create a new board position called JEDI, which is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And that board position is co-chaired or co-manned by Brad Turner and Maya Deary. And so what we're going to discuss today is Dr. Andrew Kahrl, his book, which is This Land Was Ours. And it's hopefully a first in a series of meetings and discussions where we're going to address these issues. And really it makes sense for Surfrider because one of the big goals of Surfrider, as anybody who's involved in Surfrider knows, is really about access, and through various nefarious means, access has been denied, property rights taken away to minority communities, not only in the Southeast, but all over the United States. So again, thanks everybody. And without any further ado, if Brad, you want to introduce Dr. Kahrl and get this thing started. Thanks.
Brad, you're muted.
You're on mute, Brad.
The magic of Zoom. All right. I'm Brad Turner. I'm currently in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I'm grateful for the position and the opportunity to work with Surfrider. And tonight we have a special guest with us, Dr. Andrew Kahrl, Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. He is the author of The Land Was Ours, How Black Beaches Became White Wealth in the Coastal South. He is also the author of Free the Beaches. I can't express how excited I am to have this conversation, this dialogue, and have a deep dive and to how we got here to the present through your conversation about the history and access through different means of redlining, real estate practices, FHA loans. Yes, I'm excited. And without further ado, Dr. Andrew Kahrl.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and it's a real honor to be able to speak with Surfrider Foundation in your chapter here. I mean, I've been following and studying the issue of beach access and the legal and social issues at stake for years. And right from the outset, I mean, the Surfrider Foundation has been, as you all know, has been at the forefront in fighting state by state to protect and defend public access rights and ensuring that coastal areas remain what they have all had been intended from the outset of this country's history, which is a commons, and have done so in the face of this relentless privatization of shorelines and attempts to really restrict public access to what is a cherished public resource, and one that has not just social implications but also environmental ones. So I know that this is all very familiar all of you, but again, I can just sort of start by saying thank you for the work you're doing. I think, again, this is something that I have admired from afar, and this is, speaking as someone who does not surf, and doesn't even live on the coast, but nevertheless, as a scholar and as an activist and as someone who really cares about public access and its implications for democracy, I think it goes without saying that the Surfrider Foundation has really been at the forefront of fighting on these issues. So again, I'll just sort of begin by stating that. But yeah, I think I know that being in North Carolina, and I think you're well familiar with the issues surrounding the struggle against privatization, and in particular the existential threats that climate change and sea level rise pose to the future of coastal Carolina. And I think that's in some ways what got me interested in looking at coastal areas in order to understand this relationship between racial and environmental injustice and the challenges we face as a society in helping to build a more equitable and inclusive society, and how those are tied to the struggle to build a more sustainable planet. And I think this, in some ways, the story that my book, The Land Was Ours, is attempting to tell is how the exploitation of people and exploitation of land have been historically linked. And you can begin to understand that more clearly through looking at the experiences and the history of African American communities and landowners who accumulated a substantial land base in the coastal South in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, and had fashioned a distinctive relationship with the land, with the shore, and one that has been and continues to be slowly eroded, even as the land itself is being eroded. And so I think that's one that I think, as you mentioned at the outset, Brad, some of the forces within both public policy, with regards to housing, with regards to real estate development, but also as well with regards to coastal engineering. And certainly when we get into the story of North Carolina coast, in particular the area surrounding Wilmington, Wrightsville Beach, it's very, in particular, the Freeman family story is one where you can see quite directly the negative impact that coastal engineering decisions have had for African American communities, and whose interests they've been carried out for. One in particular, serving the interests of capital and real estate over the interests of people and the environment. And this is one where that story is pretty starkly evident when you look at what happened to the Freeman family's land holdings and what happened to Seabreeze and Freeman Beach. So I'm happy to sort of talk about that, and as well as some of the other larger issues that the book attempts to raise. How did you want to get started then?
Yeah, I think it would be great to because how many people have actually had a chance to finish the book? I think most of us probably have not.
Okay.
Couple. Yeah. If you could tell the story of Freeman Beach, and I think it's particularly interesting that the story doesn't end until 2008, which I think I put into an email to you is, this does not qualify as ancient history. I mean, this is definitely stuff that's happening on the watch of most of the generations represented on this call. And so, yeah, if you could sort of go through that, I think that might be really good for us.
Sure. So I guess even to sort of, step back even further is, the history that this book is attempting to tell is really, it's the story of the challenges and the conceptions about African American life under segregation. In particular, calls attention to this history of African American land acquisition and how property acquisition was really central to Black visions of freedom in the decades following emancipation. African Americans did not get their 40 acres and a mule. That again was something that one of the many broken promises of emancipation. But in spite of that, African Americans throughout the South fought doggedly to accumulate a land base, to build up, to acquire property, and to gain a measure of independence from the plantation economy and the Jim Crow political economy of the South. And land was seen as central to Black freedom and independence in the decades following emancipation. And in that pursuit, coastal areas, places like New Hanover County, were in other areas, stretching up into Virginia and Maryland, which I also write about, all the way down to the Florida coast. These were areas that were relatively available for African Americans. These were not, especially beachfront areas and coastal areas along waterways, were often not seen as valuable real estate. In fact, quite the opposite. These were areas that were subject to still are, of course, subject to massive storms. The soil was not conducive to plantation farm style use. So these were areas that were, and often many of these areas also, I should mention, were abandoned by slaveholders and former slaveholders after the Civil War. These were some of the areas that were first seized by Union troops during the Civil War. So these were areas that for African Americans were seeking to carve out their own future, seeking to find a measure of freedom even as the federal government and the Union Army abandoned them. Many of them were gravitating to places like New Hanover County. And the Freeman family is one of those many families who sought and were able to acquire, in this case, a massive amount of land that was hugging the shore of both the Atlantic and then also what would become the Intracoastal Waterway. And so, and it's interesting, and so the story I tell throughout the book and through this and other case studies is how the relationship between African American communities was changing over these decades. The Freemans sought out and acquired this land with an eye toward fishing, toward small-scale agriculture, and also logging and other kinds of productive uses. They were seeking it, as and one in which there was a wide variety of different ways that they were putting the land to use, and that was reflective of many other communities that we found along the coast. But as we get into the 20th century, and especially as you begin to see the rise of a leisure economy, one in which beachfront areas became seen as desirable places for people to seek out recreation, to seek on weekends, and that these now, that families like the Freemans realized that that they had an opportunity to develop the land and as well capture this segregated marketplace of African American pleasure seekers who had been, that's the other thing is as places like the Carolina coast are becoming increasingly sought out for leisure, for vacationing, and for other pleasure seekers. We see Jim Crow and segregation become rigidly enforced in these areas. And that again is in contrast to what was formerly, in some instances, a much more integrated social environment prior to the rise of this kind of modern leisure economy. So, when we get into the 1920s, places like Carolina Beach, Wrightsville Beach, these are areas that are rigidly enforcing Black exclusion and subordination in public space and within their local economies. And so African Americans are finding that areas that they had once been able to use and enjoy for fishing and for common use are now being closed off to them. They're being locked out of areas. Wrightsville Beach went so far as to actually literally have a pass system that prevented African Americans from even entering it unless they were in a service capacity. Up and down the southern coastlines, local communities that are creating public beaches are designating them for whites only. African Americans are finding again that areas that were treated as a commons are now becoming places where they are being excluded from. So that's, again, a story that perhaps for those who've studied the history of Jim Crow is a familiar one. Black exclusion, segregation, and denial. But that's only part of the story, because the other part of the story is folks like the Freeman family who see opportunity to provide spaces for Black communities to find pleasure and leisure on their own terms. And so that's what begins to happen, is that the Freeman family begins to develop the area that became Seabreeze, and then later the area on the ocean front that became known as Freeman Beach. And so that begins this story of really a vibrant community and cultural space, as well as a varied Black economy centered around hospitality, centered around entertainment. At one point, the Seabreeze area had upwards of like over 30 different juke joints, nightclubs. They had an amusement park. You had all these different forms of entrepreneurship that are taking place here that are being conducted by and targeted for African American consumers. And so again, this is a story really of how African Americans are taking the conditions imposed by white Southerners under segregation and turning them into opportunities to really create and build a vibrant Black economy. And using, again, the land that had been built, that land base that had been built up in the decades before. I mean, it's really remarkable. I mean, again, this is one of the untold stories about of African American history, is how much land African Americans acquired in the half century following emancipation. By 1910, African Americans had upwards of 16 million acres of land throughout the South. Again, and had done so in the face of innumerable challenges, obstacles, and threats. And so again, the story of the Freeman family and the hundreds of acres they built up is really, again, a remarkable story of resilience. And are doing so even into the 20th century as decisions being made at the federal, state, and local level are quite literally eroding their land base. So, I talk about how as the Seabreeze is forming and taking shape and becoming a popular destination that is attracting African Americans from throughout the Carolinas and beyond. The Army Corps of Engineers, at the behest of Carolina Beach real estate and development interests, are carving pathways. First, what was known as Snow's Cut, which was facilitated commerce or facilitated transportation between the Intracoastal Waterway and the Atlantic Ocean, and then later I'm blanking. It's the Myrtle Grove. Let me pull up my map here. The Carolina Beach Inlet, which was devastating to quite literally resulted in hundreds of acres of land that the Freeman family owned being washed out to sea. All of these decisions are being made in the interest of white businesses, white property owners, and a white-based economy centered in Carolina Beach, and doing so directly at the expense of the Freeman family. That's only one sort of, so there's this environmental threat that the Freemans are facing. But then there's also these legal challenges to their property rights, which is another part of the story I tell. And this is one where the challenges the Freeman family faced it was one that was being repeated throughout the coastal South and really throughout the South as a whole, which was the legal theft of Black property through a process known as Ayers property partition sales. This has been recognized as been one of the major causes of Black land loss throughout the South. Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, African Americans accumulated upwards of 16 million acres by 1910. That number began to plummet, and to today, under 5 million acres by some accounts. And much of that was being lost through legal but highly unethical exploitation of laws that allowed for developers, allowed for large agribusiness conglomerates to essentially steal land from African Americans without any compensation or any adequate compensation. So, just as a kind of quick explainer, if you die without leaving a will, your land will fall into this kind of what is kind of known legally as tenants in common, in which your descendants inherit the land in the form of undivided shares. So they all kind of have common claim to the land, but it's not they don't have there's no clear title. And so the courts in these instances, it becomes something where without a kind of without clear title, you have sort of limitations on what you can, your access to, say, you can't get a mortgage to build on it. You're ineligible for a variety of federal assistance programs, disaster relief, which comes into play here with the result of Hurricane Hazel, which was devastating to the Carolina coast in 1954. But it also makes you very vulnerable. In particular, vulnerable to this trick that developers could use, and they exploited, especially in these areas where coastal property is becoming highly valuable, whereby a speculator can come in and essentially buy one of the shares to that land from a descendant. And I should mention, after the original deed holder dies, if they die without leaving a will, the number of shareholders in a given piece of property multiplies with each successive generation. So, which can get upwards of, say, 100 or more people claiming a share of that property. And those shares can be sold to third parties. And if, say, a developer is able to get a hold of a share to a given piece of property, they can then go in petition the courts to put all the property up for sale. And they can do so even against all the family's wishes, even against the wishes of the people who live on the land. And so this was a tactic that developers would exploit in these areas where, say, you have large numbers of heirs property owners that are sitting on valuable property. Now, I should also mention, again, just to step back, why is it that this was something that was affecting African Americans more so than others? Well, this is a part of the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of African Americans' political disfranchisement and denial of access to fair and legal representation. That, quite frankly, many African Americans who acquired land during the Jim Crow era didn't probate a will, or if they wrote a will, it wasn't kind of the courts wouldn't recognize it. And so this was something that, again, was disproportionately affecting African Americans because of the legacy of racism in the past and its ongoing role in the courts today. So again, this was something that was affecting, in particular, the disputes over the area at the northern tip of Carolina, the northern tip of Carolina Beach, the area known as Freeman Beach, which was part of that original land acquisition that Robert Bruce Freeman, the family patriarch, had acquired. But because the courts didn't recognize the will, there was disputes over the boundaries. That offered an opportunity for developers to come in and begin to sort of acquire land that the family felt was rightfully theirs. So again, that is kind of brings us up to the sort of what happened in recent years. And this was something, again, that is still very much a subject of dispute. I keep in touch with some of the Freeman family members to this day, and while many family members still live in the area, the fate of Freeman Beach and what sort of how parts of the Freeman family's land holdings on the ocean front were acquired by developers, became very valuable properties, bringing in millions of dollars for its owners while the Freeman family never saw a dime. I mean, again, this is one of many stories that I tell in this book of how, black beaches, black property became white wealth. And I think, again, the larger point I'm trying to make here, and again, it's sort of in thinking about the causes of racial, the historical causes of racial inequality today, in particular, the racial wealth gap, which is by some measures the largest index of inequality of all. That by some accounts, you could say that it's been estimated that that the racial wealth gap between white and black Americans stands at 11 to 1, so extremely wide. And so historians have and policymakers talk about, well, what are the causal factors of this? And as Brad mentioned at the outset, the history of redlining is one of them. The denial of access to homeownership and the opportunities to build wealth through homeownership is a very important factor in looking at why this wealth gap stands at such is so wide. But I would also say another one is not just the denial of opportunities to build wealth, but also the theft of black wealth. And I mean, quite literally here are stories about properties that African Americans owned, sources of potential wealth building for black communities that were taken from them. And taken through quasi-legal processes that were being conducted oftentimes by courts that were outwardly hostile to African Americans' interests. This is also a part of that story, is how black property became a source of white wealth, and how that was being repeated up and down the coastal South. Not just in North Carolina. I mean, you look at a place like Hilton Head Island, a place that before the 1960s was entirely African American occupied. I mean, you wouldn't see a white face anywhere on Hilton Head Island, and substantial portions of Hilton Head Island were owned by African Americans. Today, again, is a place that is filled with golf courses, condos, and commercial establishments that are generating, unfathomable amounts of wealth for its owners, almost all of whom are white, whereas in African Americans, the few remaining African Americans living on Hilton Head Island have been pushed to the margins and have not been able to realize any of the wealth that has been generated through that leisure-based economy. And so I think, again, this is a story that has real implications for diagnosing the problems we face today.
So, I mean, well, here, Sailor's got a question before I repeat this. Could you go briefly over the history of the black ownership of Bald Head Island? How did that come about?
So hold on here. So, I'm not familiar so much with the story of Bald Head Island.
Okay. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The history of I'm sorry. I was conflating that and another place. What's the history? Did Bald Head have black ownership? I'm not sure.
Maybe are you referring to Shell Island or?
No, I think Sailor's asking about Bald Head. There is a story about a Texas developer coming in and buying up Bald Head, but I think he bought it from white property owners. But Shell Island is also an interesting story.
Yeah.
Seems particularly relevant to us.
Yeah, so I talk about the story of Shell Island, which was one of many real estate and ventures being launched by African Americans in the 1920s, seeking to capitalize on this growing demand amongst increasingly mobile and growing black middle class that are seeking out vacation destinations, seeking to develop leisure spaces and entertainment destinations for African Americans in this segregated society. And so, and Shell Island was, so just to kind of back up, I mean, this was an area just north of Wrightsville Beach on the coast that had been previously kind of an area along the shoreline, along the coast that had been used informally by African Americans. But in the early 1920s, a group of investors, an interracial group, both white and African Americans, got to partner together to acquire and then begin to develop a seaside resort for African Americans. And they began subdividing the land, selling plots for seaside cottages to be built. This was again a venture that was being trumpeted up and down. I mean, as far as there was news stories up in Harlem and New York that were being written about this new coastal destination for African Americans in North Carolina. Well, no sooner than had this venture got off the ground than white real estate interests and white developers and leisure-based businesses in Wrightsville Beach and in Carolina Beach and throughout the area saw this as a threat. And in particular, again, they saw the presence of African Americans enjoying leisure on their own terms as a threat to their own economy. They saw, they were perfectly happy with having African Americans as servants, bellhops, groundskeepers, all the kind of menial labor that these areas depended on. In fact, that was in some ways kind of, the presence of African Americans as laborers and as servants was kind of part of the world that white leisure and vacation destinations sought to create, that kind of sense of mastery that white families were seeking out. But the thought of having African Americans enjoying leisure themselves was deeply threatening to the kind of whole Jim Crow order. And so places like Shell Island, and as I write about, there was many examples of this, were seen as a threat, and a threat that local white people in positions of power, both politically and within the business community, were intent on snuffing out. And so we don't know, there's never been determined, and many of these, again, they just chalk them up as fires of undetermined origin because, of course, police, law enforcement were not interested in investigating. In all likelihood, they were probably in on it. But Shell Island was besieged by a series of arson attacks, fires of that ultimately doomed this venture within a few years after it got off the ground. And I write about this was one of many instances where you would have groups of African Americans coming together, acquiring land, seeking to develop it for families, for communities to seek out for their own leisure and recreation, only to have that be subject of attack. And again, all that, not just the sort of space itself, but all the money invested in it, gone. And so that's, again, a very one of many tragic examples of how the sort of white supremacy and the maintenance of white supremacy was very much focused on and intent on preventing any signs of Black success, any instances of African Americans' own independence and autonomy and upward mobility. And leisure was, leisure activities were one of those areas where, could in some respects be seen as just as threatening as African Americans, seeking to vote or seeking other sorts of, or even seeking to integrate white spaces. It wasn't just about, whites wanting separation, but they wanted subordination. And they wanted all, and any sort of signs of African Americans resisting that, not just through kind of entering into white spaces, but claiming spaces for themselves, became subject of attack. So yeah, that's, again, one that, I think we should, probably, especially for, recognizing that history in North Carolina, there's a lot more to be done. I think, as you probably all know, a book that just came out last year retells the story of the Wilmington Massacre, one of the darkest chapters in American history. But I think, again, that was, perhaps one, that was one of many instances where these kind of coordinated attacks on African Americans, both political independence, but also here, just even, as something as simple as a real estate venture could be, vulnerable to attack.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions here, if you don't mind. I have a question here from Kevin. says the intro reference to Orrin Pilkey and the comparison of land itself to the people who live by the sea as both being in a state of dynamic equilibrium.
Mhm.
He says he understands the reference in terms of barrier island geology, but can you further explain how it applies to the people?
Yeah, I think what I was referring to there is how, you know, in the early 20th century, at a time, prior to the rise of of the modern leisure-based economies, prior to the rise of coastal engineering, modern coastal engineering, and efforts to stabilize shorelines and make them, um, turning commons into real estate and seeking to stabilize these areas and kind of hold the and limit the environmental fluidity and changes that are natural to coastal areas, that you would often find that the people who lived there intended to reflect and live in a way that was reflective of the land itself, which was one that was highly volatile, dynamic, and in some ways didn't kind of fit neatly into what we think of as the kind of the segregated South. That these were areas that, in the late 19th and early 20th century were characterized by a greater degree of racial mixtures. Oftentimes, you would see kind of communities that didn't fit in, that were where you would have, say, whites and blacks living, working, and congregating alongside each other. You had living arrangements that oftentimes reflected just how fragile the areas were. Again, home, structures that were built with the expectation that they would probably be blown away, within the coming storms, and in a way, a way of life that was more fluid, more, I think, in some ways, more in tune with the environment, the unique conditions of coastal environments, and in ways, again, that don't that maybe call to mind a different sort of set of relationships between white and black Southerners than we think of when we think of the Jim Crow era. Um, that again begins to change as these areas become highly sought out by developers, and also as well as they become much more integrated within the national economy, both in terms of infrastructure, development, causeways that are building roads right out to the the beachfront. I mean, ironically, it's like the kind of the integration of the coastal South into the nation's economy actually led to the further segregation of coastal societies. So it's that kind of dynamic that begins to sort of take place as we get into the 20th century, where these places become the uniqueness of them becomes diminished, and increasingly, as we see kind of the interest of capital, the interest of developers take precedence. Some of those things that made these areas very different a generation earlier begin to disappear. I think that's kind of what I was referring to there. But I think, again, it's that kind of, that sense of that dynamic equilibrium that is natural to beachfronts, that, again, that these are highly mobile spaces, areas that are not conducive to the types of kind of real estate development that we've seen over the last, 50 plus years. That again is, a challenge and one for both policymakers, and it's something that we need to certainly bear in mind as we're looking at how do we create a more sustainable future for people and for the ecosystems along coastal areas.
Thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Dave. He asks, have the Freemans or anyone in a similar situation been successful in unraveling or getting compensation for these legal property takings?
No, I mean, and that's the problem. And I think again, that's where when we have these conversations about reparations, when we have these conversations about restorative justice, we need to put this on the table, and not, and I think, you know, we, not just in the kind, you know, what happened in Wilmington in 1898, what happened in Tulsa in 1921. I mean, these, you know, undeniable examples of racial terrorism, theft, that you know, scar the landscape in our collective memories, need to be, you know, we need to also add the quiet, almost bloodless injustice that were being carried out in courtrooms throughout the South and under the color of law. I mean, again, what happened to the Freemans, you know, was and what happened to so many families who lost their land through these, again, quote unquote, legal processes, but ones that were highly unjust, that were built on the backs of past discrimination. I think that's, again, that kind of, you know, you can say, yes, this is a legal process here, but look at all the sort of injustices and discriminations and that led us up to this moment. And I think, again, that is one of where the story of Black land ownership and Black land loss, while the end of the line was often something that could be called legal, and the courts, you know, could sign off on it and say that they were not in any way acting in a you know, discriminatory or illegal fashion. It was built on many injustices up till then. And so, you know, one thing that can be done, I mean, again, this is where we have seen progress in recent years. Great progress is changing the laws. My colleague at Texas A&M Law School, Thomas Mitchell, he who just was a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. So Thomas Mitchell has been he's been writing about and calling attention to the problem of heirs property, the way that that developers, agribusinesses, and other land grabbers have exploited these the unique vulnerabilities of Black farmers, Black landowners, to steal their land, you know, through a legal process. So he was, you know, early on, I mean, you know, couple decades ago, was writing about this in law reviews and calling attention to it. But then he went a step further and drafted model legislation for how to curb some of the worst abuses of these laws. And this model legislation has been adopted in states across the U.S. And actually, now that I'm blanking on whether or not North Carolina has. I believe North Carolina has, the North Carolina State Legislature. But South Carolina has, Georgia has. I mean, many states have adopted this legislation, which it aims to protect families who are threatened by loss of their land due to this these unique kind of legal circumstances. Virginia, where I live, just actually the governor signed these reforms earlier this year. So this has been happening, right? I mean, again, it's not addressing the injustices of those who have already lost their land, but it's doing something to address, you know, and protect those who are endangered now. And I should also, again, point you to, and I encourage everyone to go and learn more about what Thomas Mitchell has been doing, and in particular, what he plans to do with the award he got from the MacArthur Fellowship Program, to continue to repair the damage that this decades of Black land taking has inflicted. But I think, again, you know, it's not just the kind of gross abuses and acts of terrorism and extra legal and downright illegal actions that have unfolded in the past, but also sometimes things that are ostensibly legal, but nevertheless very much you know, unjust.
Thank you. All right, we have one more question up if we have time.
Oh yeah, you've got time.
So we have a question from Chad who wants to know, we know that the most sustainable way to address sea level rise is through adaptation and managed retreat, which is not easy. Assuming we will move back and shift our land use patterns, do you think there are opportunities to make right away, make right any of these injustices?
Well,
justice applied to our coast.
yeah, I think again, this is one of the greatest challenges we face as a society right now is and Warren Pilkey, many others, coastal geologists, people who've been writing about this and are far more knowledgeable about the geology and science of coastlines than I am, have been saying for a while now we need to begin a process of retreat. But as a historian, and one who in particular has a focus on issues of inequality and inequity, I say as well that we need to think about how we can do this in a way that doesn't just simply replicate or even worse, exacerbate existing inequalities. That actually prioritizes the needs of small landowners, of low-income communities in coastal areas, and as well, those African American communities who have already been victimized by and already been on the front lines of experiencing the worst challenges of climate change. Which again gets back to that original point I made is, we need to recognize, especially if we're talking about, say, a Green New Deal, or talking about putting in place programs and policies that will both address and respond to the challenges of climate change, that we need to recognize that that social justice, and in particular racial justice, must be at the forefront, because you can't have one without the other. The history of climate, of the forces that have brought us to this point, in terms of the human causes of climate change and sea level rise, and in particular the damage that is going to be inflicted on coastal areas, which has been exacerbated and made so much more worse by excessive development and privatization. Those very same things have had damaging effects on Black communities and on small landowners. So again, the very things that have brought us to this moment, both were had environmental and social implications, and so anything going forward is going to have to look at those two as inextricably bound together. So again, I would say that I'm very much someone who thinks that we're well overdue for having a conversation about managed retreat, and respond, and certainly need to begin. And again, that's why I so greatly admire the work that Surfrider Foundation has done in protecting the commons, putting some teeth into the public trust doctrine, ensuring that these areas are recognized as public resources and not private property, and fighting back against the attempts of billionaires, as Surfrider was doing out on the West Coast, where they were trying to, take public beaches and, turn them into, private gated resorts. I mean, that is certainly a part of the process, but also as well as, the having discussions about where do we go next, and especially where do we, how do we respond to communities that have been devastated by hurricanes, by flooding, and do so in a way that that recognizes these existing inequities and attempts to address them through public policy and through programs, as opposed to just simply ignoring them, or worse yet, kind of making those problems worse. So again, that's, I think, I don't have all the answers to it, certainly, but I think having that in the forefront of these public debates is going to be essential.
I just want to explain the file that I shared with you all is from this book, and this gets at the question about, this is a book by David Zaselski called The Waterman Song, and it's a history of maritime North Carolina, and he has a really it's a beautiful rendering. Hopefully we'll have a conversation with him at some point about how these coastal areas were kind of beyond the strictures of the color line in a lot of the Southeast. And that picture is, I heard him talk once and he said that kind of photograph or that kind of etching, that kind of rendering of a group of men would not be integrated, but from the late 19th century all the way until the late 20th century. That you had to get up to the 1970s and high school football pictures before you would once again see integrated groups of males depicted in that way. And that brings me to a question, which is that, I mean, these policy things seem so important and big and a little bit overwhelming, but really crucial to figure out. And it seems to me so important that we, you know, when we're working on a chapter level, that we work really hard to try to bring more voices and more people into the discussion. And so I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what you see as the importance of just access on a more, not individual level, but a community level to ocean play and waterfront play, and, you know, how you think we should sort of structure our efforts in terms of, yeah, I mean, bringing kids to the beach, making sure they can swim, and making sure their moms are comfortable with them swimming, and, you know, all the things that we're likely to run into as we address these issues.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think a really important issue, and one that I think it was really laid bare this past summer as you know, the COVID summer, as we saw across the country just how important access to outdoor space is, both for our own personal health, for our personal and psychological well-being, and also how important it is, how critical it is to a healthy democracy, and a true democracy, and one in which you know, you have a public, and public space is crucial to creating a truly integrated and inclusive society. And when that's, and I think, you know, this past summer I wrote a piece in the New York Times as we were seeing across the country these really troubling developed trends where you had, on the one hand, local communities, you know, city pools, and that had been that were used oftentimes, you know, disproportionately and relied upon by communities of color for summer recreation, for places for their children to play, for them to get swimming lessons. That across the country, cities closed their pools, not just because of public health concerns, but also because their budgets had been decimated by the pandemic. So, you know, so you had, you know, across the country, public swimming pools were closed, and you know, they're not out of the woods even after the pandemic ends, because, you know, local governments are, you know, they're seeing their budgets just, you know, cratered from as a result of the pandemic. So real questions about, you know, how do we fund and support public resources for recreation. At the same time, this past summer, you saw private country clubs, private pools, private beaches, or say wealthy communities that had public beaches doing everything in their power to keep the public out, you know, sort of, you know, hiring more security, you know, to keep people away from their beaches, away from their pools. You know, Connecticut, which I, you know, write about from, you know, the book that you mentioned at the outset, Free the Beaches, which my second book, which tells the story about, you know, this, you know, very wealthy coastline that had throughout the 20th century done everything they could to privatize the public shoreline through enacting all these measures that essentially amounted to a form of segregation that effectively denied the state's African-American population from accessing their shoreline. You know, they did so through resident-only ordinances and other kinds of ostensibly, you know, non-racial restrictions. But, you know, again, at the end of the day, it was one that had a segregationist impact. You know, these same communities last summer, places like Greenwich, Connecticut, and Westport, you know, as soon as, you know, they used the pandemic as an excuse, as I put it, as an excuse to reintroduce exclusionary policies. You know, so Greenwich, which actually, you know, the state Supreme Court had knocked down and said that, you know, you can't have a public beach that's for residents only. It's not a public beach if it's only for residents. You know, the public's everyone. Nevertheless, you know, so they, you know, that was knocked down in 2001. The state Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. They used the pandemic this public health emergency as an excuse to bring it back. And the question will be, what's going to happen next summer, And so I think we have to remain vigilant and fighting to protect public access, because that is going, all efforts to help bring about greater inclusion, having opportunities for people of diverse backgrounds to be in spaces together through, kind of what I describe as fortuitous association, coming into contact with people you don't know, but should maybe get to know, and people of different backgrounds. I mean, public space is essential to creating those types of environments where people of different backgrounds, economic, racial, ethnic, can actually begin to be around each other and get to know each other. And then, the long-term work of building a more integrated society can begin. And without those spaces, it's very difficult. And I think, one of the things that really worried me and continues to worry me about, what's going to happen after we get out of this is, are we going to continue? Are we going to allow for this privatization to continue, or is it going to get worse, or are we going to maybe hopefully recognize just how important public space is to all of us? So I think that's where I come from, the vantage point of saying that we have to have the we have to create the conditions for even these types of more inclusive worlds that we hope to bring about to be possible, and that again, quite literally begins with having spaces where people can come together. And I think, again, leisure and recreation is one of these areas where, we oftentimes, sort of, maybe don't prioritize it enough, or maybe don't notice until it's too late how much of it is being taken from us, or being taken from the public and being handed over to private interests. But I mean, this has been something that I've written about and continue to sort of call attention to, is just this alarming trend toward the appropriation of public resources, public spaces, by private interests. And the effects are one that just make us more unequal, more divided, more segregated. And for those who, again, for those communities that have come to rely on public spaces and public, beaches, public pools, to have that taken out of their worlds is going to have devastating social, health, you name it. It's going to really, so it's something that we need to really take seriously. I know you guys do so, but but I think finding ways to communicate that to a broader public, I think, is essential to being able to then achieve these larger objectives of bringing a more diverse, sort of group of people into the types of spaces that you and I both, cherish and value.
Thank you.
It's great to hear. Currently, we don't have a busing system at our Wrightsville Beach location. Have you ever successfully or seen an successful fight won for exclusion in the public transportation area?
Yeah, I mean, this is, maybe I'm kind of a downer on all these things, because most of what I write about is just how much, wealthy people, white segregationists, have fought to prevent these types of things that we all recognize as being really important. And so, some of you might know the story of Jones Beach on Long Island. Robert Moses, the famed or infamous urban planner of New York City, who, when building the causeway out to this new state park, this new state beach, built the overpasses low enough so that city buses could not get out there. So essentially, kind of foreclosing the possibility of New Yorkers who would rely upon public transportation to get to the shoreline. It prevented them from being able to do so, and instead made it essentially, only accessible to families that owned an automobile. I mean, that's just the most infamous example of a long history of how, privileged Americans and in particular white Americans have fought to undermine public transportation so that they could then have places to themselves, or whether it be their suburban enclaves that cities like Atlanta, again, where they've fought to prevent the extension of public transportation, light speed rail, and into suburban communities, because they see that as something that might lead to a greater diversification of their communities, and are, willing to sit in traffic for hours upon hours all day, willing to pollute their air with exhaust, and just willing to just create, an almost unlivable environment so as to keep their communities exclusive and white. It's just, again, a shameful legacy, and one that, again, points to how racism and environmental destruction are fundamentally linked together. But, and again, going back to my book about Connecticut, the same thing was happening there. These communities were fighting to keep any kind of public access to their shoreline and to beachfront property, and did so through limiting public transportation, preventing any kinds of sort of access, meaningful access amongst urban communities, amongst the state's African American population, from being able to reach these shorelines. So I think, again, part of the sort of the public conversation needs to begin by recognizing that issues like public transportation are social justice issues. They're not just, it's not just about convenience. It's not just about kind of, just simply, these types of public investments have environmental benefits. They have a whole host, but they're also ones that have real direct implications on social inequality, and how do we build a more, how do we ensure that these places that are open to the public are actually truly open to the public and are truly accessible to a broad range of the public, including those who rely upon public transportation to get places. And as well, are expanding access in these areas is also good environmental policy. So I think that's an area where, from my vantage point, it's about calling attention to the ways that answering the question of, why do we have so little public transportation? Why do we have so little light speed rail? Why again, if you go to Europe and go to many other parts of the world, go to Asia, that's how people get around. And here we're all just sitting in cars, and that is a legacy of racism. That is one of the ways that our racially divided and highly unequal society perpetuates itself. So, undoing that involves expanding these types of access opportunities.
Thank you. I think I have another one here from Sailor in New York. Question involves all the Civil War stuff in the South, and the best way I can summarize it, we have Fort Fisher here, and there's a lot of symbolism here. Do you think that that type of symbolism could be intimidating from, say, a Northerner coming to the South?
Well, I think particular, the Confederate iconography, the monuments, all of these were built, the naming of military bases after traitorous Confederate generals, which, again, if you think about just the absurdity of that. But, all of that was being done in order to fortify and reinforce white supremacy. It was, and again, I'm sure, hopefully we're past the debate, the question of whether or not these things were being named for in order to honor the war dead or whatever. Here in Charlottesville, which I'm sure you all know about, was at the center of a white supremacist attack in 2017. We had neo-Nazis marching in our streets, and they came here because they wanted to defend a monument to Robert E. Lee. A monument to Robert E. Lee that was not put up when Robert E. Lee was still alive, or not even when his children were still alive, or any of the people who fought with Robert E. Lee were still alive. It was put up in the 1920s. Now, why was it put up in the 1920s? It was put up to proclaim, it was not to honor the the defeat of the Confederacy, or it was to celebrate the triumph of white supremacy. I mean, these monuments were being put up as celebrations of the achievement of Jim Crow. I mean, and they were intended from the outset to intimidate, terrorize Black communities, and to mark in public spaces a white supremacist narrative of America's past and its future. And again, they should all be torn down. They should be tossed out into the ocean. I mean, they should be melted down and turned into something productive. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's, I can't even believe that, you know, the fact that this is a subject of controversy just shows you how great the depths of the problem we face right now are in terms of, you know, the role of white supremacy in our public life. But again, I mean, these are, of course, I mean, again, I can only dimly perceive this as a white person who enjoys a great degree of privilege, just how outrageous and infuriating and intimidating and just how awful seeing these things could be for a person of color, or walking into spaces that are named after people who fought to keep them in chains. I mean, again, it's just unconscionable that we still have things that are named after in a celebratory manner for people who fought to protect, preserve, and extend human enslavement. It's just, again, I can't even wrap my head around it, but yet that's my job as a historian, is to try to understand this stuff, but it gets, you know, certainly not excused or in any way kind of condoned.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a great segue into our possible last question here. It seems that these stories of segregation and property stealing are true for beaches across the U.S. Are you part of a network of similar researchers, and or is there a place where these stories are aggregated?
Hmm. Yeah, so I'm actually there's been a real emergence of what is becoming known as coastal history that is taking shape, and it's actually global in scope. I'm a member of this coastal history network that is actually based out of a university in the UK. I've gone over and a couple years ago gave a talk at a university in France. There's a lot of people, and I think in some ways, you know, again, that makes sense. You know, environmental history and coastal history is something that should not be reduced to any one nation state or any focus on, because again, these are issues that are global in nature and a history that's global in nature. Now, so I think there is a real, and I think, you know, in the coming years, you're going to find that there's a lot more books that are going to be coming out on the history of coastal areas, the history of humans' relationship with the shorelines, both in the U.S. and in a global perspective. And there's really exciting work being done here. And I think in some respects as well, it reflects the recognition that these are places that are also endangered right now, and where the struggle over how we respond to and mitigate the effects of climate change are going to be happening, you know, there in coastal areas first, and where the effects are going to be experienced most directly. And oftentimes, and I think this is something that you see within historical scholarship, is that the issues and places that historians study in the past are often a reflection of our concerns in the present. And so again, just as issues of racial injustice and white supremacy have been and remain a real area of concern for scholars, and one that many historians are delving deeply into in their own work, I think in particular, the history and future of coastal areas is going to be one that is going to continue to be something that scholars are going to look closely at. More directly with regards to the U.S. context, so I'm actually right now serving as the principal investigator for a study being conducted by the National Park Service on the history of African American outdoor recreation, with a goal to create new national historic landmarks that recognize places like Seabreeze in places like American Beach down in North Florida, or places like many the places that I write about in my book, as being historically significant sites that are themselves endangered. Those that remain that haven't been acquired by developers and destroyed, those that still are here are ones that we need, whose histories need protected, and whose stories need told by the National Park Service. And so that's a project that I'm heading up right now that will include both nominations for new landmarks, but also include educational tools that hopefully will be used in high school classrooms and college classrooms in the future, that help tell this story, allow users to explore it for themselves. We've been compiling an inventory of all of the different African-American recreational sites across the U.S. I mean, not just beaches, but campgrounds, resorts, other lakeside retreats, you name it, playgrounds, parks. I mean, all the different ways in which African Americans created space and created communities through leisure and recreation, from emancipation all the way up to the present. And so, being able to identify these places, tell their stories, and tell the story of America and of the struggle for equality through the story of leisure and recreation, is one that I've been working on, and I think hopefully when we're all done, and we'll see what in terms of what the National Park Service does with this material, and also more directly what Congress does when these nominations come before them, and whether or not they will appropriate the funds. I certainly hope they do. But I think, again, these are areas where you can see sort of tangible progress. And I mean, public history, the work, most Americans get their history through going to national parks and going through public history sites. So you can make a far greater impact through work in that area than writing books that are read by scholars. So although I do greatly appreciate you guys reading my book, but I think I always recognize that this is I have a limited reach here, and these through writing academic texts in ways that public history is much more can be much greater.
Anybody else have any last questions? Thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's a real pleasure to speak with you. And again, I think I really admire the work that you're doing, and I hope that this conversation continues, and the work certainly will continue.
I hope someday you'll come surfing with us at the beach when we can all travel again. We'll push you into some waves.
I cannot. I've been waiting to get back down there. I actually was supposed to come down there in the spring for the Freeman family was actually having a big family reunion in Wilmington, and I was scheduled to speak at it. But then we did it as a Zoom call. So yes, I am eager to get back down there. So yes, I would love to reconnect then, for sure.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you again.
Thanks so much. That was awesome.
Great. Well, thanks again. Have a good night, everyone.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.